notes. Write down as much as you can. If you go online, go on YouTube, go on to websites about note-taking, you'll find lots of advice saying that you should not try to write everything down. You should just listen for the key information. The problem is, at this point in your lives, you don't know what's the key information. It's like when you're watching a movie or reading a book. Sometimes 3/4 of the way through, you see something, you're like, oh, that thing that happened way at the beginning, that was actually important, and I didn't know it until now. Same thing in class. You might not know something's important. How often have you been in class and you've sat through the whole thing, and if somebody said, what was important in that lesson? You'd say, I don't know, nothing. But then the test comes, and you're like, oh, the teacher wanted me to know all this stuff that I just ignored in class. So try to write down as much as possible at the beginning. Then, after that, as soon as possible, which is probably going to be when you get home for you guys, go back, then clean up those notes, organize them. Then you can decide what's important or not. Once you've got the whole lesson, you can go back and try to see what were the key points and everything. If you're not sure if something is important, leave it in there. Okay, you can always delete something later, but once you delete it, it's going to be hard to remember it later. So delete what is unnecessary. Try to figure out what the main points were, what things came up again and again. Make that bold, highlight it, anything like that. Just try to organize your notes so that it's more usable. The best way to take notes, especially if you're typing them out or writing quickly, is to do an outline method. You're making an outline of the information. Think of it as a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint has a heading for each slide, and then it's got bullet points and maybe another set of indented bullet points. You're just using the key information and organizing it with headings. And learn to abbreviate. Because you're trying to write down as much as you can, you want to use incomplete sentences. Like on a PowerPoint, often you'll just use bullet points, incomplete sentences. You want to use abbreviations. Come up with your own, like obviously a plus sign can mean and. There's standard abbreviations. If I want to say one thing led to another, what I'll often do is say whatever it was, and then put an arrow pointing to the next thing. That means it led to it, or cause and effect. So come up with ways to abbreviate, use symbols, things like that. So this is your first set of notes. Took as much as you can during class, then you cleaned it up, organized it. During class you can abbreviate, you can also abbreviate later, but especially when you're first writing, abbreviating, using symbols is going to help you get more quickly. Here's a quick example of an outline. So for the Inca Empire, you have the rise of the Inca, then you've got a couple points about where they began and when, how they expanded, then you've got the ruler, some points about the ruler, and so on. So a basic standard outline. Another common form of note-taking is what's called Cornell notes. Very similar to the outline, it's just using a 2-column method. On the left, you can have headings like Inca Empire. Typically, people who use Cornell will put the heading as a question, like where did they rule? And then the notes go over here. The idea of this is as you're studying, you can go through and you can look at the questions and then try to answer the questions, and then look over here and verify your answers, add to them as you need to. So it's just another form of outline notes, just you're putting the headings on the left side and typically phrasing them as questions. So you could use either one of those, they're both perfectly fine. How do you study from those notes? Well, as I said, one thing you could do is look at the headings or the questions and then try to answer them. So if you have your notes, you can just kind of cover them up and slowly lower the paper, exposing a heading. The heading says the rise of the Inca. So then you think about, okay, well, where did they begin? How did they grow? You try to answer it. Then you uncover a little bit more and see if you had all the information, if there's anything you got wrong, anything you were missing, so you can check your explanations. If you're working with other people, studying in a group, you can do the same thing, but you can ask the questions to your partner. Say, okay, so tell me about the rise of the Inca. And then that person tells you, and you can add to it, clarify, whatever you need to. So notes are really good for studying in groups. Once you have that initial notes, Cornell, outline, whatever it is, you can then use that to make flashcards, graphic organizers, thinking maps, other things. The more you interact with and engage with this information, the more likely you are to remember it. The more ways you frame it, organize it, the more likely you are to memorize it. So you're probably familiar with flashcards, you're familiar with graphic organizers, you may or may not be familiar with thinking maps. Here's an example, a bubble map. Takes that information and just says like Inca Empire right here in the center, that's the main point. And then the key points off of that, factors that united the people, the emperor, the government organization, record keeping, times, and then off of that you've got the sub details. This is a really good way to visualize the information. This is also a great way to organize it for writing an essay or a paper if you ever have to. I had a class earlier today. We were talking about writing papers, and somebody said, you know, they couldn't imagine writing a 10-page paper. So I can write 10 pages on literally anything you can possibly think of. So I need a volunteer.
To write 10 pages?
No, okay.
Yogurt.
Yogurt. Okay. Any topic. So we put yogurt in the center. If we were going to write a paper on yogurt, what are some things that we might want to include in a paper on yogurt? Nutrition, okay? So we have a thing over here about nutrition. What else? Ingredients for yogurt and how it's made. Okay, what else? Prices. And then along with prices, we could do like different companies and things like that, you know, organizations. What else?
Processing.
Okay, processing, how it's made in factories and stuff like that. What else?
Market value.
Market value. Depending on how you organize or think of it, that could be pricing and stuff like that. What about the history of yogurt? Okay, so maybe the history over here. Then with each one of those things, you branch off, okay? Now, do you think you could write one page about the ingredients and nutrition information of yogurt? Okay. Could you write one page about the history of yogurt? Assuming you did some research, there's probably a page of history about yogurt. Could you write one page about the major corporations that make yogurt? Okay. So all of a sudden, writing 10 pages isn't a big deal. You just break it up into parts, and then you're taking each part and you're writing a page, but then each page becomes, you know, a few paragraphs. So once you organize something this way, you can write 10 pages on any topic in the world. It becomes much easier. You're just organizing the information. Here's another way to organize information, brace map. You start with the main category and then you break it into subcategories. So here's Harley-Davidson factories. There's 4 of them. Then at each factory, they're either manufacturing things or assembling things. So some of them do both. Some of them just manufacture. And then at each factory, they're manufacturing or assembling different things. So you break it down. You're just taking this main category, breaking it into subcategories, and so on. And it helps you visualize and see the information and study it and remember it. Any questions about thinking maps? Brace map, bubble map, 2 examples?